We are live. Yes, Ran, you can go on.
A very warm welcome to everyone present here, all the people tuning in from different time zones and parts of the world. We warmly welcome Professor Marcus Rediker to deliver the first Satyam Jha Memorial Lecture. Before we proceed with the event, it is important to remember that we are all gathered here to pay tribute to a colleague, friend, writer, and everything that Satyam was for so many of us. We seek to pay tribute to the wonderful work he did before he unfortunately succumbed to COVID 19 at the height of the second wave in India. In his short life, he demonstrated exceptional clarity of thought and a political sensibility that was rooted in his firm commitment to socialist solidarity and mutual aid. He was a voracious reader, an eclectic debater, deeply involved with socialist ideas and histories from below. He regularly participated in study circle discussions, and his brilliant translation of Rahul Sankrityayan's essay Dimaagi Gulami can be read on the Lokayata blog. In the days before his demise, Satyam tirelessly volunteered to help people affected by COVID 19 as part of several student led help desks, arranging hospital beds and oxygen cylinders at a moment's notice during odd hours. In the week of what would have been his 20th birthday, we want to remember, cherish, and pay tribute to him through this memorial lecture as we all try to cope with the loss of Satyam. We are extremely pleased and honored to have with us Professor Marcus Rediker, who will be speaking on the topic Reflections on History from Below. Marcus Rediker is the Distinguished Professor of Atlantic History at the University of Pittsburgh. His Histories from Below has won numerous awards, including the George Washington Book Prize, and has been translated into 17 languages worldwide. He is the author, with Peter Linebaugh, of The Many-Headed Hydra, Sailors, Slaves, Commoners, and the Hidden History of the Revolutionary Atlantic, and The Slave Ship, A Human History. He is the producer of the prize winning documentary film Ghosts of Amistad, directed by Tony Buba. He is currently working as the guest curator in the J.M.W. Turner Gallery at Tate Britain and writing a book about escaping slavery by sea in antebellum America. We welcome you, sir. Over to you now.
Okay. Thank you, Ryan. Thanks to all of you who are a member of the study circle. It's an honor to be with you in this memorial lecture. I'm very happy to learn more about Satyam Jha, and I think it's a lovely gesture that you want to remember him in this way. I'm very happy to talk with you today about this subject that is dear to my heart, history from below. It's something I've been practicing for the last 50 years. And I thought I would begin by talking a little bit about what history from below is. So if we could have the slides on the screen, please. Okay, very good. Thank you. Okay, so reflections on history from below. What is history from below? History from below is a way of studying the past. It's a variant of social history. It's also got several different names. It is sometimes called radical history. It's called people's history. It's sometimes called engaged history, or even the history of everyday life. So it actually is not a new concept, history from below. The phrase itself goes back to the 1930s. The first person to have used it was the French historian Lucien Febvre in 1932. And it began to be used much more frequently by another very great French historian named Georges Lefebvre, who was the leading scholar for much of his life of the French Revolution. Wrote many important books, including The Great Fear, about the role of rumor in the coming of the French Revolution. So it has its origins in the 30s. And another person who was quite aware of this kind of history at that time was the great German poet and playwright Bertolt Brecht, who in 1935 wrote a poem called A Worker Reads History. And I think it would be fair to say that this poem is the anthem of History from Below. And it begins famously with questions. Who built the 7 gates of Thebes? The books are filled with the names of kings, but was it kings who hauled the craggy blocks of stone? Of course it wasn't kings who hauled the craggy blocks of stone. Who are the people who did, and what was their history? Those people who built the 7 gates of Thebes. This is a poem about building, about the people who actually created the world that we live in. So Brecht wrote this in 1935, and as I said, History from Below had a kind of efflorescence in that decade of global radicalism, I might note. Okay, History from Below is associated with insurgency. It's associated with movements from below. So it comes as no surprise that it exploded. And I think its really most important formative moment was the 1960s and the 1970s. This was the result of a great many different movements from below. In the United States, the origins of this really is the civil rights movement, which began in the late 1950s and gained strength in the 1960s, the emergence of the Black Power movement. Both of these movements demanded a new kind of history, one that took seriously the issues of race and slavery in the American past. But that's not all that History from Below was by any means. It gets another powerful boost from the anti-war movement. And by that, I mean the movement against the war in Vietnam. So anti-imperialist demands, political demands, prompt a new look at the role of the United States around the world. Very important contributions in this area. And then, of course, there is another major movement that comes along a little bit later, but has its roots in this period, and that is the women's movement. And the women's movement, in some ways, makes the most radical set of demands on history as a discipline by demanding that the larger part of humanity be included, that women's role in history be a major part of what we understand the past to be. So take all these movements together, what you get is a really powerful force demanding a rethinking of history and posing really basic questions. Who is included in history? Who is excluded in history? And really, quite crucially in the end, whose history is it? To whom does history belong? Okay, these are questions that these movements raise. So that's my first point. History from Below is born of movements from below. But my second point, and I think equally important, I do want you to understand that History from Below is a tradition of historical writing. Okay? This is a long, rich tradition of scholarship. Many thousands of people have contributed to it all around the world. And in fact, Indian History from Below is a very important subject. Labor history is very important, I realize, in India. I've been to India a couple of times myself. I've met a lot of colleagues. I'm particularly impressed with the work of Shumit and Tanaka Sarkar, who were quite close to E.P. Thompson. I might add, I'll have more to say about him in a few minutes. But History from Below is a global phenomenon. It exists in almost all parts of the world. It has a different sort of genesis in each place, but it occupies, I think, an important position in the way history is done, both in the U.S., in India, and globally. Okay, so that's just a brief introduction. I want now to lay out for you what will be the themes of my talk this evening. I think it's evening in India. I want to talk about 5 themes. I'll talk first of all about my own path to history from below. There are many, many paths, but I thought it probably would just be best to tell you how I came to it. That's my first theme. A second theme, I want to talk about history from below and the problem of sources. Okay, this is a key question. Third theme, history from below and storytelling. That's the third theme. Fourth, I want to use some of the books that I've written to illustrate different variants of history from below. And then finally, I want to conclude by outlining for you what I take to be the 6 essential elements of history from below. In other words, what are the component parts of history from below? What are the things that we need to be thinking about as we do that kind of work? So that's the place that where I want to end up. Excuse me, maybe I should mention that I'm still myself recovering from COVID, although I'm much, much better. So I will have an occasional cough. Okay, so I want to begin by talking about 3 books that I think are very important to me in particular, but in general, very important to most everyone who practices history from below. And I want to go back to the 1930s. Again, that formative period. A West Indian scholar activist by the name of C.L.R. James, you see here him pictured on the screen. C.L.R. James wrote just an astounding book called The Black Jacobins, Toussaint Louverture and the San Domingo Revolution. This is the revolution in Haiti, which broke out in 1791 and continued through 1804, resulting in this Black nation, once the crown jewel of France's colonial empire, becoming the Western Hemisphere's second republic after the United States, and only a few years later. Well, James himself is a very interesting figure. He was active in the international communist movement. He was a follower of Leon Trotsky for a while. His ideas did change over time, but he remained wedded to an interpretation of history that was based on class struggle, but also introduced the element of race as a really critical component of how history happens. Now, you have to remember that when James wrote The Black Jacobins, and actually for many years thereafter, most historians had really kept that revolution out of this larger frame of the Age of Revolution, which was considered to be the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the revolutionary movements in Europe, but somehow Haiti was kept out, even though it was probably the most radical of all of those revolutions. Well, James wrote against that kind of censorship, and in doing so, he created a kind of history from below in which we see the 500,000 enslaved Africans in Haiti changing the course of history, because they are the force that created Toussaint Louverture, the great leader of the Haitian Revolution. So I want you to note, for James, history from below is transnational and it is transatlantic. It is not confined to the nation state. It's something bigger and broader. And I think it took scholars of the African diaspora to understand this. Okay. Now, I do want to mention that James's ideas that appear in the Black Jacobin, as I've said, will continue to evolve over time. Now, there is a concept from James that I think is really critical to History from Below, and that is what he called working class self-activity. What that means basically is the things the working class does for itself to liberate itself from various kinds of oppression. So this is really a fundamental history from below concept. What working people are doing for themselves? What forms of resistance do they engage in? James, that idea is in the Black Jacobins in a kind of germinal state, but it will emerge much later, a little later, especially in the 1950s, when he's involved in radical political work in the United States in a group called Facing Reality. And I would urge you to learn about that group, the Facing Reality group. So James is someone who had a tremendous impact on me. And of course, I ended up doing Atlantic history. And in some ways, James is really the origin of that sort of interpretation when it comes to History from Below. Let me talk now about a second book, The Making of the English Working Class by E.P. Thompson. Edward Palmer Thompson, who, by the way, had very strong ties to India. I hope you know this. Very important that you understand that India was a big part of the experience, the political experience of the Thompson family. Edward's father was a Methodist missionary in India. And Edward himself used to brag that it was Nehru who taught him how to properly hold a cricket bat. So Edward Thompson in 1963 published this book, The Making of the English Working Class. I would have to say that this, if you were to ask historians around the world, what is the most famous instance of History from Below, and perhaps the most influential, that overwhelmingly they would name this book. This book that Thompson published in 1963. Note that date. Now, this book had its origins in what was called the Communist Party Historians Group in Great Britain. Folks, this was a study circle. This was a study circle which actually produced several of the most brilliant historians the world has ever known. Not only E.P. Thompson, but Dorothy Thompson, Christopher Hill. We'll talk more about him in a minute. Eric Hobsbawm, people who really changed the course of historical writing. So I just want you to know that the kind of thing that you have organized, this study circle, has a distinguished history, and it can lead to great things. There have been a few things written about the Communist Party Historians Group, including an essay by Eric Hobsbawm himself. So I would urge you to look into that to see how that group actually worked. By the way, that group refused to read the Black Jacobins because it was known that the author was a Trotskyist. So there was a degree of sectarianism in that group. But anyway, Edward Thompson was part of that experience. He wrote this book. It's basically a book about class formation. The Making of the English Working Class. It's about class formation. And the main idea that comes out of this book is actually parallel to, but not identical to, what James saw in working class self-activity. Thompson is the person who is most responsible for creating the concept of agency, of the working class as an agent of history, as a maker of history, as a creator, as an active part in the historical process. Okay? And so this book, The Making of the English Working Class, is in some ways a manifesto for History from Below. But I do want you to know one thing about the way this book came to be so important. This book was written and published in 1963. And by the way, Thompson at the time was working in adult education, teaching workers in Halifax about labor history. So he did not have a typical academic career by any means. The book was written in 63, but the book was made in 1968 with the worldwide explosion of radicalism. At that point, young activists all over the world started reading this book because they were hungry for an example of history from below, because they were making history themselves in the streets. History from below became important, and Thompson's book became very important. Okay. Now I want to talk a little bit about Thompson's close friend, Christopher Hill, who, unlike Thompson, had one of the most spectacularly successful academic careers a Marxist has ever had, as Christopher ended up being the master of Balliol College, Oxford, for a number of years. Hill was also a member of the Communist Party Historians Group. His specialty, however, was the English Revolution, really the first major revolution, he thought, in world history, which begins in the 1640s and runs its course through the 1650s before it's finally defeated in 1660. Hill wrote about this as a bourgeois revolution, but he also wrote about it as a history from below, a more radical revolt within the revolution. And the book that is the best example of that part of his thinking is The World Turned Upside Down: Radical Ideas During the English Revolution, published in 1972. Now, this is a book about a really wild and colorful collection of groups called the Diggers, the Ranters, the Seekers, the Levelers, the Muggletonians. These were radical Protestant groups who, in the middle of the English Revolution, because censorship had broken down, emerged, their voices emerged, they published a lot, proposing solutions, radical solutions to the problems of the day. They proposed returning the land that had been enclosed to the peasants who had lost it. They proposed the abolition of wage labor. They proposed the abolition of slavery. Just an extraordinary body of radical ideas. And Hill captures that in this book in what I would call an intellectual history from below. So Hill has an intellectual history from below. Thompson's history from below was social. James was kind of social and political. Hill's has a social component, but it's primarily about ideas. And you begin to see here the variety that history from below can take. Okay, I'll come back to intellectual history from below a little bit later. Okay, so those are three books: The Black Jacobins, The Making of the English Working Class, and The World Turned Upside Down, which had a dramatic impact on the way my thinking and my historical research developed. And I dare say these books have affected a lot of people around the world. I think they're classics of the genre, and I would urge your study group to read them. Okay, so let me talk now about sources. Here's the biggest dilemma of writing history from below. You're writing about ordinary working people who didn't produce very many sources of their own. We don't have many first-person sources from these nameless, largely unknown people who built the world all around the globe. They just didn't leave us very many sources. So this is the great challenge of history from below. How can you do that when you don't have very many sources of evidence in which people are telling their own stories? in their own voice. Okay? So, history from below requires an approach to sources that is quite different from traditional historical approaches. It means reading sources between the lines. And of course, everybody does that. Reading against the grain. In other words, reading sources to make them divulge secrets that perhaps their creators had not intended. Because overwhelmingly, historical sources are produced by the middle and upper classes in all kinds of ways. They produce the sources. They produce the documentation that is what historians must work with. So the question is, how do you get those kinds of sources to tell you about history from below? Well, E.P. Thompson had a very colorful way of putting this problem. He said, what you do is you take the document, you hold it up to a satanic light, and you read it backwards. Now, this is poetic and funny, both quite common things with Edward Thompson, but it was also kind of an allusion to the way in which witches were prosecuted in the 17th century. The idea was that one sign of a witch was that he or she could read things backwards. That's kind of like turning the world upside down. So in a very real way, what Thompson is saying is that witches make the best historians from below. So the question is, where do we find this evidence? Okay. And here is, I think, one of the most important lessons that I've learned in doing history from below all these years. If you want to write history from below, you have to understand how any given society, whatever society you're studying, how it produces evidence about poor people. Now, this can happen in hundreds of different ways. It might happen in the records of poorhouses. It might happen in the records of prisons. It certainly happens repeatedly in legal records. And I think it would be safe to say that legal records, court records, have been some of the most important documents that historians from below have used. But note this. You've got to figure out which institutions in society produce evidence, how they produce it, what kinds of evidence it is, what are the limitations of the evidence, what are the strengths of the evidence, so that you can then read that evidence against the grain, under a satanic light, to make it give up things that perhaps, as I've said, its creators did not intend. And the final point about sources is that history from below requires that you be creative. You know, every source counts. I mean, as I was working on sailors, I studied court records. I'll say more about that in a moment, but I studied sea shanties, songs that sailors sang at sea. I studied travelers' reports. Anything and everything really counts. And folks, that's because writing history from below is hard. It's hard. You've got to know that going into it. You will hit blind alleys. You will find great discouragement. You'll think you can find something and it's not there. But you can't let this deter you. It's hard. A good friend of mine, Daniel Vickers, who wrote a tremendous book about sailors called Young Men and the Sea, once said in a workshop that we did, he said, to do this kind of work, you need a staggering capacity for tedious labor. And I do think that's true, because history from below is hard. What you have to learn in order to recreate the multiple contexts of history from below is very, very hard to acquire. That knowledge is priceless once you get it, but you have to work hard to get it. Okay. I want to turn now to this theme of storytelling. And I want to recommend to you really an extraordinarily brilliant essay by an extraordinarily brilliant man, Walter Benjamin. Benjamin wrote an essay called The Storyteller. And this is just an extraordinary thing because what he talks about is the social history of storytelling. And he identifies two primary kinds of storytellers. There's the peasant storyteller with tremendously deep local knowledge. And then there is the sailor storyteller or yarn spinner who has a kind of global knowledge. Maybe not as deep about one particular place, but this is someone who comes from afar and brings stories and knowledge back from overseas. Okay, so Walter Benjamin says these are two fundamental kinds of storytelling. Well, as it happens in my own personal case, I learned the art of storytelling from my grandfather, who was a Kentucky coal miner. And I guess he would be one version of the peasant storyteller. And he was a magnificent storyteller, told these riveting, funny, gripping, tragic stories, and just quite just a powerful art form. The story, the way he told it. And then, of course, I ended up studying sailors who traveled around the world and became vectors of knowledge. So these two kinds of storytellers have both been very important to me. Another point Walter Benjamin makes is that every good storyteller tells a big story within a little story. In other words, there's always some big implication, something bigger than the story itself is being illuminated. The great anthropologist Clifford Geertz once said, "The issue of sheep stealing speaks to the issue of revolution because the investigator makes the connection." Okay, so you got to look for the big story in the little story. Now, it's true that we work with stories as we write about the past, but I want to suggest that historians need to be self-conscious storytellers and to use literature and poetry as they tell their stories about the past. It is of great significance to me that James, Thompson, and Hill were all very interested in the social history of literature, using novels, short stories, poetry, and the rest as evidence for writing history from below. And I do think that poetry occupies an especially important part in all this, because in using poetry that's written in the past, you can get closer to the consciousness of historical subjects than I think you can with other kinds of writing. Okay? And then the last point about storytelling is that this is a really democratic way of doing history. This is a way in which everybody can understand, right? You can take very complex scholarship and put it in a democratically accessible story and reach a very broad public, writing not just for the 15 specialists in your field, but for a much broader public. And I think the best history from below always tries to do this, to tell its stories to the broadest possible public. This has actually been very important to me and has led me into filmmaking, writing a play, working with museums, trying to find all kinds of media through which I can present history from below to people who might not read books. Okay? So speaking of books, let me talk now about what I learned in writing several of my books. This is an image of a pirate being hanged, a man by the name of Stede Bonnet, hanged in Charleston, South Carolina in 1718. And you'll notice in the background the masts of ships and sailors watching. Well, this was kind of a crucial theme in my book called Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea, which is about merchant sailors and pirates in the first half of the 18th century. What we see here is a ritual of terror enacted by the ruling class, in this case of South Carolina, to try to send a message to sailors that if you become a pirate, you will suffer this fate. We will track you down and we will kill you. So, this speaks to the fact that the big story within the little story, really in all of my work, the big story is the violent, terror-filled rise of capitalism around the Atlantic. So if I study sailors or any other subjects, which I'm going to get into in a minute, there's always a reference back to that global history of capitalism and the violence that it depended on. Okay, now, when I started this work, what became that book, Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea, when I was in graduate school, began in 1976. And when I decided I wanted to work on sailors, the very wise people who were my advisors in graduate school all had the same reaction. You won't find any evidence. But I was hard-headed, and so I had some ideas about where I could find evidence, and I went off and did it. And lo and behold, I got lucky, although it wasn't all luck. I found this treasure trove of documents, the High Court of Admiralty papers, where maritime cases from around the Atlantic and around the world were heard. These were wage disputes, mutinies, piracies, sometimes murder of a sailor, murder of a captain. And there is this massive amount of evidence. I was able to study about 2,200 cases. Now, if I'd listened to my advisors, I would have gotten another topic. So here's something else about history from below that I can mention to you. I do believe in the biblical adage, seek and ye shall find. I do believe that if you approach this matter creatively, you can find sources. And that was the major takeaway from this particular book. The next book I published, I co-wrote with Peter Linebaugh. It's called The Many-Headed Hydra. And this book actually grew out of both a love for and a critique of Edward Thompson and Christopher Hill. Because Hill had written about the English Revolution in the 1640s and 1650s. Thompson had written about English radicalism in the 1790s. And so Peter Linebaugh and I wanted to ask, what happened in between? And what we discovered was what happened in between was an oceanic generalization of radicalism around the Atlantic. So we ended up following C.L.R. James in doing transnational history from below. Okay, that's what the Many-Headed Hydra is all about. It's about transnational history from below. It's about a series of events. Now, this book, my first book, covered about half a century. The Many-Headed Hydra covers about 2.5 centuries, from roughly around 1600 to the middle of the 19th century. Very different scale and chronology of history. That's another aspect of history from below. You can do it in many different kinds of time frames. But the key point here is transnational history from below. My next book was called Villains of All Nations, and this was a study of pirates in the Golden Age. That's the 1710s, 1720s. This is the era of the Jolly Roger, the black flag with the skull and the crossbones. And this is maritime history from below. It is, in some ways, the ship, which was a wooden world unto itself. It's that world turned upside down. Because what I discovered that pirates did was to elect their officers and divide up their resources in a very egalitarian way, doing things that poor people usually never had a chance to do. That's because they managed to capture this really highly developed technology called the ship, which they used to undertake a really extraordinary social experiment of running a ship without the violence of the usual regimen of the ship captain, whose power in the 18th century was almost completely unchecked. But here are these poor sailors. I mean, they're all just poor sailors coming together on board these ships and devising a new way of organizing themselves. This is self-activity. This is agency. This is people building an alternative social world. Okay, so the next book is in some ways the most challenging book I ever wrote. And I do think it was kind of the ultimate challenge for history from below. This is a book called The Slave Ship, A Human History, which is about the British and American slave trade in the long 18th century, roughly 1700 to about 1808. And the challenge of this history is that about 12 million, 13 million Africans were loaded onto these ships, carried across the Atlantic to power the plantation system that was crucial to the rise of capitalism. And almost none of these people left any written sources about what that experience was like. So history from below, I mean, this is, folks, literally history from below, because this is about the lower deck. You're looking at the arrangement of enslaved Africans on the lower deck of a French slave ship called La Marie Seraphique in the 1770s. So my challenge was to try to imagine and to reconstruct the experience of the people who went through this chamber of horrors. Okay, so in some ways, this is was a tremendous challenge. I can say more about that in the Q&A if you like. But here's what I was trying to undo. You know, all books are written against something, against other books. I felt that the histories from above of the slave trade, and including the histories that relied on statistics, I felt like those histories were radically inadequate for understanding the slave trade, because we need to understand it in human terms. So this book is written against what I call the violence of abstraction. The way in which, if you just talk about the mortality rate and the length of the Middle Passage and the number of people on board on any given slave ship, you'll never really understand the human reality. So this is one of the things history from below can do. It can get you close to the human reality, and I tried to do that in this book. Now, I wrote a sequel to this book called The Amistad Rebellion, An Atlantic Odyssey of Slavery and Freedom. This was published in 2012. And this was the history of a single revolt on board a ship called the Amistad. This took place in 1839. And if the Many-Headed Hydra is about 2.5 centuries, this book is really about 3 years, from 1839 to 1842. It is rather a micro-history in the tradition of Carlo Ginzburg, whose book, The Cheese and the Worms, is really one of the great histories from below. I would encourage you to check that out and read that too. But anyway, what I ended up doing in this book was attacking the prevailing interpretation of the Amistad case, which had focused on the legal victory that abolitionists won in allowing the Amistad Africans to become free and to return to their home in West Africa, Sierra Leone. And in that telling of the story, it had been whitewashed, and the heroes had become the white abolitionists and the judges. I thought that the Africans were the hero of this story. So I went back and wrote a new history of this case, which had long been dominated by legal historians, and emphasized the African origins of the revolt. To me, that was the most important thing. And finally, to return to this idea of intellectual history from below, my most recent book is called The Fearless Benjamin Lay, a man who was a Quaker and a dwarf. He was about 4 feet tall, with a hunchback, who was one of the most radical critics the institution of slavery ever had. And he called for the total worldwide abolition of all enslaved people 2 full generations before an abolitionist movement emerged. So the question I wanted to pose in this book is, how did he do it? And now this is an ordinary working man. He was a shepherd. He was a sailor. He sailed around the world for about 12 years. How did he make this breakthrough that slavery must be abolished at a time when the overwhelming majority of people of European descent considered slavery to be a perfectly natural institution? Okay, so intellectual history from below becomes a way of understanding even a huge movement like the abolition of slavery, because you can zero in on this man who had such a tremendous impact, even though he had been somewhat marginalized in the telling of the story of abolition, because working class people didn't figure in that story. It was only enlightened middle and upper class men who made abolition. But in any case, you see here, intellectual history from below. This book goes right back to Christopher Hill and The World Turned Upside Down. Benjamin Lay was a latter-day version of the Levelers and the Ranters and the Quakers and Diggers. All those radical ideas were combined in this particular person. Okay, so let me conclude now talking about the 6 essential elements of history from below. What I'm doing in this part of my lecture is that I'm basically summarizing for you the conclusions of a graduate course that I have taught twice now. I taught it for the first time at the University of Hawaii, Manoa in Honolulu in spring 2019. And I taught it again at the University of Pittsburgh in the spring of 2020. And that course was entitled How to Write History from Below. So we read James, we read Thompson, we read Hill, we read a wide variety of other histories from below. And here is some of the distilled wisdom of history from below. Its essential elements. First of all, it treats ordinary working people as subjects of history. Like Benjamin Lay, there was nothing elite about Benjamin Lay. His entire life experience was just as an ordinary working person. Okay, so whether it's an individual or an entire class that Thompson studied, or an entire Atlantic class that Peter Linebaugh and I studied in the Many-Headed Hydra, history from below takes ordinary working people as its primary subjects. Okay, that's point number 1. Point number 2, the context of history from below always involves relationships of power. It involves oppression. We might add exploitation, and it involves resistance. So history from below, I want to emphasize here, is always also at the same time history from above, because that's the force field of history. You have to understand the power that is being wielded against working people if you want to understand how they respond to it. So power is central. The forms of oppression, the forms of exploitation, the forms of resistance, these things are highly variable over space and time, but wherever you are, you're going to find them. And they are crucial to history from below. A third essential element, history from below concentrates on experience. Now, Edward Thompson wrote quite a bit about this, the importance of experience, the lived experience of history. Very crucial that we try to take that into account. Benjamin Lay's experience as a sailor helped him to develop an ethic of solidarity, which he then applied to enslaved people. How does experience work within the making of history? Okay, a fourth element is consciousness. History from Below is very interested in the consciousness of ordinary people. Now, this is not easy to study, but it is really crucial. We're interested in class consciousness, but not only class consciousness. We're interested in consciousness of race. We're interested in consciousness of gender. We're interested in how all of these things fit together. Disability, sexuality, all of these things can be linked in the consciousness of people, and how that linkage takes place is really crucial. Benjamin Lay, I come back to him as an example. He was class conscious, he was race conscious, he was gender conscious, he was environmentally conscious, and he was a champion of animal rights as a vegetarian. All these different kind of radicalisms fit together in his consciousness. And of course, he was unusual in that regard, but there are going to be many other such intersections, so we need to study those. That's the fourth element. The fifth is voice. We've got to do everything we can to recover the voice of those people struggling from below. Now, in those documents I studied in the court cases, I got lucky because sailors would come in and the court scribe would write down what they said about this mutiny or about that wage dispute. But finding documents like that is really crucial. And when you find them, they're precious. So whatever we can do to humanize these working class subjects of history, we need to do it. And one of the most important things we can do is to attend to their voice. What were their voices? What were they saying? And if you understand what they're saying, you can better understand what they are thinking. And the last thing, and in some ways the most important thing, I come back to these two ideas that I introduced at the outset. James's idea of self-activity, excuse me, and Thompson's idea of agency. One of the really big things about History from Below is that it treats ordinary working people not just as subjects of history, to go back to the first point, but as makers of history, as people who exercise power. You know, agency, I'm kind of sorry to say, it's a much abused concept these days. Everybody talks about agency, but they've forgotten the way in which Thompson pioneered the term. Agency is about collective use of power. How do groups of people wield power to change the course of history? And that ultimately is what History from Below is about. How ordinary working people change the course of history. And here's something that's very encouraging about it. You never know when it's going to arise and make a huge difference. Nobody had any idea that this small revolt over on the north coast of Cuba, the Amistad revolt in 1839, would lead to an Atlantic-wide debate in which the most powerful people in the world, kings and queens and members of parliament and congressmen and Supreme Court justices, were debating the meaning of what those rebels had done. Right? And I would add, as a more recent encouraging development of history making from below, nobody expected the upsurge of activism and protest after the murder of George Floyd. We witnessed after that event probably the greatest surge of anti-racist activism that we have ever experienced worldwide. And so this just goes to show that history from below can arise when you least expect it, and it can fundamentally change the world we live in. And I'll stop right there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for delivering this very enlightening and wonderful lecture. Now I would urge Krishna Priya to delivered the vote of thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ananyo. Hello, everyone. I'm Krishna Priya. On behalf of our entire team, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Professor Marcus Rediker for delivering this memorial lecture. A heartfelt thank you to everyone who turned up for this session. We are really happy to have had you all as a part of this event and hope to see you all in the future once too. Thank you.